This video on biodiversity is part of a collaboration with the fine people at Art House Politics. Look for a link to their channel in the description below, and keep your eye out for their response video, which will be coming next week. I thought that since the last video was so popular that I might as well keep going with the trend, which I guess is let's watch Doug eat. You know, when my kids were little, we'd take them here and the fries were shaped like animals. Now they're just shaped like fries. Hello, Zero Books readers. It's me again, Douglas Lane. I'm at the zoo today, and in this video, we'll be taking a look at some excerpts from the books Austerity Ecology and New Work, New Culture in order to figure out what to do about this biodiversity crisis we're in. In March of last year, the geologist and journalist Damian Carrington wrote an essay for The Guardian entitled, "What is Biodiversity and Why Does It Matter to Us?" The answer, according to Carrington, is that biodiversity is a variety of life on Earth, in all its forms and all its interactions. It is, quote, comprised of several levels, starting with genes, then individual species, then communities of creatures, and finally, entire ecosystems, such as forests or coral reefs, where life interplays with the physical environment. These myriad interactions have made Earth habitable for billions of years. This seems relatively sound, but then Carrington goes on. A more philosophical way of viewing biodiversity is this. It represents the knowledge learned by evolving species over millions of years about how to survive through the vastly varying environmental conditions Earth has experienced. Seen like that, experts warn, humanity is currently, quote, burning the library of life. These lines bother me. They bring to mind Adam Curtis's BBC documentary series, All Watched Over by Machines of Loving Grace, and Jordan Peterson's Lobsters. Something about the notion that all the various living organisms on Earth, except for humans, have properly worked out how to live, bothers me. What's to separate Jordan Peterson's notion of a body of human myths that have been developed and tested by the struggle to survive over millennia, and this notion that the totality of life on Earth itself amounts to a body of knowledge, a library of wisdom on how to live? Does the idea of biodiversity rely on a naturalistic fallacy? Adam Curtis's documentary series, All Watched Over by Machines of Loving Grace, argues that in our digital age, we've abandoned the notions of human power, authority, and politics in favor of more comforting ideas about ecosystems, feedback loops, and natural harmony. The title he gave to the second episode in his series was The Use and Abuse of Vegetational Concepts, and it was taken from a 1935 academic essay by Sir Arthur George Tansley, an early pioneer of ecology who was educated at Cambridge. In his essay, Tansley concluded that, quote, in an ecosystem, the organisms and the inorganic factors alike are components which are in relatively stable dynamic equilibrium. And it was this idea of a networked system of organisms coming together into a state of dynamic equilibrium that Curtis took issue with. Curtis interviewed the still living ecologist Daniel B. Botkin. Botkin is somewhat well known as a critic of this idea that nature exists in a state of dynamic equilibrium, or that there is such a thing as a natural balance in the world. In an essay he wrote in 2013, for instance, Botkin argued that nature, in all its characteristics, climate, oceans, ecosystems, species, populations, is always changing. This doesn't mean that we can't do damage to the natural world. It doesn't mean that what we call climate change is just normal change, and we don't have to worry about it. But it does mean that we can't go home again. There is no state of nature to return to. There is no library of evolved wisdom that will tell us what the world should look like. The other day I was walking with my son, taking him to school, I think, and we were discussing Jordan Peterson and Slavoj Žižek, of course. One of the things we were discussing was this idea that human beings have a unique responsibility, that we have the burden of discovering just what we feel that is meaningful and what we feel like our duties are. We have according to Žižek, have the responsibility to pick our duties and then bear the consequences. So I asked my son, Noah, what would you say is your duty? What would you pick out as your aim, the thing that would make your life meaningful? And he said, penguins, dead penguins. There aren't enough of them. We need to kill more penguins. My son is a 14-year-old edgelord. One of the consequences of the popular idea of a natural balance to the world is the elimination of change from our understanding of it. The idea of balance erases the idea of change from our conceptions of vegetational life, animal life, ecological life, but most importantly, from our own self-conceptions. In his book, Austerity Ecology and the Collapsed Porn Addicts, the Zero Books author Leigh Phillips demonstrates this tendency when he criticizes the idea that there is a fixed carrying capacity for human beings on the Earth. According to Wikipedia, the ecological notion of a carrying capacity of a biological species in an environment is the maximum population size of the species that the environment can sustain indefinitely, given the food, habitat, water, and other necessities available in the environment. Phillips wonders how this can be applied to human beings. He writes, quote, "The attraction of the concept of carrying capacity is its simplicity. The number of variables is essentially two: the number of organisms and the amount of resources. For some reason, scientists use bacteria in a petri dish as a metaphor to help explain the carrying capacity concept. There's a limited amount of medium, food, in the petri dish. Bacteria consume the medium at a fixed rate. Eventually, the number of bacteria exceed the amount of medium available per capita and begin to die off." The first problem with this model is that the petri dish is a classless society. There are no bourgeoisie and proletariat bacteria consuming resources at a radically different and dynamically changing rate. It makes sense to talk of average consumption rates of bacteria, but no sense at all to talk of the consumption rate of even the typical Westerner, let alone the average human. Only humans experience a class society. The second problem with the model is that it underestimates the capacity of innovative technologies to unlock new reserves of finite resources. Another notion that, in the popular imagination at least, needs to be revised is this idea of an Anthropocene. The idea of the Anthropocene is that we are living in a new epoch, a new era not of history, but of geological time. It is a word that is also a warning. We are changing the conditions on Earth, screwing with nature in ways that will have ramifications for eons to come. We have to take account of what we've done to the Earth, of how fundamentally we've changed it. You should be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth and subdue it and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the fowl of the air and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth. Well, if you take that part of Genesis to be not just a new rule for a new creature called man, but also prophecy, you have to admit that this is one time where the Bible got it right. We have it. We've done it. So a lot of people, when they hear about the idea of the Anthropocene, feel as though what it means is that since human beings now are responsible even for the weather, that we should back off, let nature run its course, let it do what it wants. But in fact, when the idea was put forward, it was meant to be a way of arguing for massive human intervention in the environment. Maybe we'd have to darken the skies to protect ourselves from global warming, like they did in the Matrix. Maybe we need to fill the seas with Brawndo. After all, that's what plants crave. If we're going to intervene in nature, the first place to start is in our own human nature. We have to start with ourselves and intervene in the way that we structure society in order to be free to do the things that are necessary to stave off environmental calamity.
We're now responsible for nature. We've developed to such a degree that we're changing the direction the ecological world is headed in, and for the worse. In order to change direction, we can't just retreat, but have to include humanity and human society amongst the things we have dominion over. We have to get control of ourselves. And in order to do that, we have to free ourselves from capitalism. In his book, New Work, New Culture, the author Frithjof Bergmann argues that the process of freeing ourselves from capitalism will involve a reversal. He writes, "What is new work? In the past, the task to be performed was the goal, the end, the purpose. The human being was used by others, or himself, as the tool, the instrument, the mere means for the achieving of this end. We human beings subordinated ourselves. We placed ourselves into the service of work that needed to be done. New work is an effort that has now gone on for over 20 years to reverse this. We should not be serving work, but work should serve us." According to Bergmann, if we are to break from work in the service of alienated authority, work in the service of value production, say, we should seek out work that springs forward from our inner selves, that provides us with the sorts of satisfactions that come along with the discovery of meaning. But at this point, I can't help but recall a parable that I first encountered in the situationist book, The Revolution of Everyday Life. I found it in a chapter entitled The Reversal of Perspective. Raoul Vaneigem, the author, starts off explaining the reversal with this story. Two brothers, deeply attached to one another, had a strange habit. They marked the nature of the day's events with pebbles, a white one for each happy moment, and a black one for each moment of misfortune or displeasure. But when, at the end of the day, they compared the contents of the jars, one found only white pebbles, and the other only black. Fascinated by the persistence with which they lived the same experience differently, they both agreed to ask the advice of an old man, famed for his wisdom. "You don't talk to one another enough," he said. "Both of you must give the reasons for your choice and discover its causes." From then on, they did so, and soon discovered that while the first remained faithful to his white pebbles, and the second to his black ones, in neither jar were there as many pebbles as before. Where there had been about 30, there were hardly more than 7 or 8. After a short while, they went to see the wise man again. Both looked extremely miserable. "Not so long ago," said one, "my jar was filled with pebbles the color of the night. My despair was unbroken. I continued to live, I admit, only through the force of habit. Now I hardly ever collect more than 8 pebbles, but what these 8 signs of misery represent has become so intolerable that I cannot go on like this. And the other said, every day I piled up white pebbles. Today there are only 7 or 8, but these obsess me to the point that I cannot recall these moments of happiness without immediately wanting to relive them more intensely, and in a word, eternally. This desire torments me. The wise man smiled as he listened to them. Excellent. Things are shaping up well. Keep at it. And one thing, whenever you can, ask yourselves why the game with the jar and the pebbles arouses so much passion in you. When the 2 brothers next saw the wise man, it was to say, we asked ourselves the question, but we could not find the answer. So we asked the whole village. You can see how much it has disturbed them. In the evening, squatting in front of their houses, whole families discuss the black and white pebbles. Only the elders and chieftains refuse to take part. They say a pebble is a pebble, and all are of equal value. The old man didn't conceal his pleasure. Everything is developing as I foresaw. Don't worry, soon the question will no longer be asked. It has lost its importance, and perhaps one day you will no longer believe you ever asked it. Shortly afterwards, the old man's predictions were confirmed in the following way. A great joy overcame the members of the village. At the dawn of a troubled night, the rays of the sun fell upon the heads of the elders and the chieftains, impaled upon the sharp-pointed stakes of the palisade. When I first read this story back in the 90s, it puzzled me. There were a few months when I would turn to Vanahim's book nightly, rereading it, and especially rereading this parable. I'd sit on my balcony in Northwest Portland, look down on the Thriftway grocery store, and drink beer or wine while considering the meaning of this strange and violent tale. Obviously, there was something radical about it, but what did it mean? What slowly dawned on me over the years was that the difference between the elders and the rest of the villagers was their relative power, and this difference in power brought with it a change in perspective. The villagers were concerned with their own lives, with the daily pleasures and pains of their individual existences, but the elders reigned over the totality of life in the village. The elders didn't concern themselves with individual moments of pain and joy, but with the system that set up the terms and the context that those pains and those joys arose in. In order to escape from the task of calculating the utility of their own lives, in order to get beyond the pleasure principle, the villagers had to seize the power of the elders for themselves. They had to shift from the pursuit of their own individual and fragmented pleasures and seek out the responsibility for setting new terms, new meanings for life in the village.
I'd say that we haven't yet reached the Anthropocene, that the true Anthropocene will be the moment not when we're unintentionally responsible for the weather, but when we can figure out how to marshal humanity for a creative project rather than blindly chasing after what Marx called value. Right now we commodify nature. We turn everything into a product for sale, but we can do better.
Thanks for watching this Zero Books video. If you enjoyed it, subscribe to this channel and click on the notifications bell so that you'll be alerted whenever we release a new video. You should also consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons get access to our Inside Zero Books podcast every week and can get access to the Zero Books Book Club and help us to continue making online content from the left.